Hey everyone, it's Mark from Flight Sim School. Today we're going to be having a look at the takeoff and climb phases in the 777 with a little bit more of a focus on how the trim works as we hand fly our departure up to about 8,000 feet or so. We'll also have a look at some of the different autopilot modes on the climb out so that if you run into trouble with your 777 that you can feel confident about intervening and getting yourself back on track. Once again, we're picking up right where we left off. We're holding short of the runway and there's only a few things that we need to do before takeoff here. In terms of our official before takeoff checklist, if we bring that up, the only item is to make sure that our flaps are set to 5, so I'll do that now. And while those are extending, we'll actually do a few extra things as well. Let's head up to the overhead and we'll start by turning our landing lights to on with the hidden click spot that's just above the 3 switches. And the other thing that we can do here is turn our APU off by just switching it to the off position since we won't be needing it anymore. The next big topic that I want to start talking about though before we get in the air is the trim. Because although the 777 is a fly-by-wire plane, unlike in an Airbus, you still need to trim the plane correctly when you're hand flying it without the autopilot. The controls for the trim are on the yoke, and you're definitely going to want these bound to keys on your controller if they aren't already, because you'll need it any time that you hand fly the plane. The goal of trimming, just like with any other plane, is to alleviate the pressure that you're exerting on the controls. So for example, on takeoff, you wouldn't want to have to hold the controls in a nose-up pitch the entirety of the time that you're hand flying it. The difference with the 777 is that the only time you actually need to retrim is when there's a change in speed. Other things that cause configuration changes, like raising the gear or the flaps, won't require a trim change. It's going to handle those automatically for you. The way it accomplishes this is actually different if you're in the air or on the ground. When you're on the ground, any change that you make to the trim directly affects the position of the horizontal stabilizer. So in the previous video, when we set our takeoff trim to 5 units, that actually physically moved the stabilizer to the position that we told it to. When you're in the air, on the other hand, what the yoke switches do is change something called the trim reference speed instead. So rather than directly changing the stabilizer position with the switches, the computer's now deciding where the stabilizer trim needs to be based on the airspeed that you want it to fly. And any configuration change like we were just talking about would be handled for you automatically. At the end of the day, what all of this really means is that you have to retrim the plane anytime there's a speed change when you're hand flying without the autopilot, and we'll see how that works a little bit more as we take off because I think it'll be easier to show than explain. One thing that I always find kind of hard though, even with normal planes, is to figure out how far out of trim I actually am, but luckily PMDG have added a feature that doesn't actually exist on the real plane but makes it a whole lot easier to see and understand the trim reference speed when you're just getting started. So if we go down to the CDU now, we'll head over to the backup one, we can head into the menu, then we'll go into PMDG setup, options, and finally under simulation we'll want to make sure that we've toggled the show fly-by-wire trim ref speed option that's right there. What that'll do is once we bring the gear up, it'll add a blue fly-by-wire marker on the airspeed tape that's going to tell us where the trim reference speed is set. And again, although this isn't a real-world option, I find for a sim it's a pretty useful compromise. Alright, at this point we can get going, and this is where things start to happen fast. So what we'll do is advance the throttles to around 50% or so. We'll give the engines a couple of seconds to stabilize, and then from there what you want to do is press the screw that's in the bottom left of the MCP. What that's actually doing is pressing the toga button that's on the throttle itself. The screw button is really just there as a convenience to not have to look down. And once you do that, it's actually moved the throttles up to the marks on the N1 gauges, which is the D-rated power setting that we calculated for takeoff. Once you come up on the V1 call, rotation speed won't be far behind, and you can start pulling back to rotate at about 2 degrees per second, but just be careful not to go too quickly because it is super easy to tail strike. The positive rate call is going to be your cue to bring the gear up, and then follow the flight director by putting the nose at the center of the magenta crosshairs. The fly-by-wire indicator is now showing on the PFD as well, and it's pointing basically at our current airspeed, so we're in trim for now. And as we continue to accelerate here during our climb out, we'll need to retrim the plane for every new airspeed that we want to fly. We've just gone past the flaps 5 speed, so we can bring the flaps to 1 now, and we're going to want to accelerate as well. So I'll retrim until the fly-by-wire indicator is pointing at the up speed for the flaps, and that'll avoid me having to hold too much pressure on the controls in a nose-up position as the plane speeds up to that speed. Once the plane gets to the up speed is where I'll bring the flaps fully up, and now it wants to accelerate out to 250 knots. So again, there's an airspeed change, which means we need to retrim the plane again for that new speed. Although we've been retrimming for every speed change that the auto thrust has commanded, the other thing to be aware of is that if you were to not apply any control inputs, the plane would eventually stabilize at whatever airspeed that you set the fly-by-wire indicator to. So in a way, that fly-by-wire indicator allows you to control the speed the plane is flying during manual flight, but it can take a while for it to stabilize at that speed. It won't be instant. Of course, this is all if you're hand flying your departure, and if you don't want to worry about any of that stuff, what you can do is turn the autopilot on as low as 1,000 feet, and like that, the autopilot takes care of trim and everything else. But hand flying is a lot of fun, so I just wanted to give you a rough idea of how to do it. Once the autopilot's engaged, make sure that you have LNAV and VNAV enabled, and that'll take care of keeping you on your flight path by following all of the waypoints. However, you'll still need to do a little bit of work for the climb to your cruise altitude. If you recall, before takeoff, we set our altitude window to 12,000 feet because that was the first restriction all along our route. And if we have a closer look at the legs page on the CDU, you can see that restriction is showing here as well. It needs to cross dark at 12,000 feet or below. That's what that little B is for at the end. And it's showing in magenta to indicate to us that that's the active restriction that it's currently following. We're climbing with VNAV right now, so if we reach 12,000 feet before we get to dark, the plane's automatically going to level off to obey that restriction. And even if we increase the altitude on the MCP beyond 12,000 feet, let's say we put it up to 36,000 for our cruise altitude now, the plane is still going to level off at 12,000 feet, and it won't go beyond that altitude until it's past the restriction, which we'll see in action in just a few seconds. Alright, so you can see that we're level at 12,000 feet now, even though we told it that it could climb up to 36,000 with the altitude window, and that's because of that restriction at dark that we need to cross at a maximum of 12,000 feet. There are some situations where you might want to actually climb higher than a restriction allows for though. Say for example, if ATC clears you to continue to climb before you reach that restriction. The way that you override that behavior is by pressing the altitude intervent button, and that'll tell the CDU to clear the current restriction and it'll start climbing a few seconds later. If there was another restriction further along our route, that would now become the active restriction that it'll follow, but for us here that was the only one, so it's going to continue to climb out to our cruise altitude that we set. Once things have started to settle down in the climb is when I'll usually go back to the overhead to turn my landing lights off because we don't need them anymore since we're above 10,000 feet, and I'll also free my passengers to move about the cabin as well. As you go through the transition altitude, which in North America is 18,000 feet, the altimeter is going to turn yellow in the bottom right of the PFD, meaning that it's time to set the standard altimeter pressure of 29.92, and you can do that by pressing the STD button, and that'll set it on your PFD, the first officer's PFD, as well as the backup instruments. Let's continue looking at the different FMA modes and how we can manipulate them. The leftmost field that we see here shows us what the auto throttle is doing at any given time. On takeoff and climb, that'll be thrust ref like we see now, meaning that the thrust is set to whatever we configured during our pre-flight. If you recall, we picked takeoff 2 for takeoff and we left the non-derated climb power, and that's what's showing in the ICAS display above the engines. The next mode after thrust ref that you'll find yourself falling into during your climb out is speed, which means that the auto throttle is commanding the speed shown in magenta on the top left of the PFD. And you can always override this speed as well if you want to or need to by pressing the speed intervent button and then changing the speed to whatever you need. And as you can see, that also works in thrust ref as well because I just did it here. There is another auto throttle mode called hold, which you'll run into very briefly on your takeoff roll, but even more so on the descent, and we'll actually look at that in the next video since it's going to be more relevant to that phase of flight. The second FMA field is to indicate what your roll mode is. Right now we have LNAV armed on the MCP, so it follows all of our route waypoints for us. But the other thing you can do is switch into heading mode to manually tell the plane what heading you want it to fly. And this comes in especially useful again if ATC asks you to fly a given heading or you need to vector yourself around for landing. Let's see a little bit more about how that works. We'll start by syncing our heading to our current heading by turning the knob until it's pretty much aligned with our heading that we're flying right now. And then to switch into heading mode, we'll just press on the top of the button. That'll change our FMA mode into heading select. And now any change that I make with the heading bug here is going to be reflected by the airplane and it's just going to follow whatever I tell it to do. If you press the hold button that's just below the heading selector, the FMA indication is going to change into heading hold. And if we change our heading now on the MCP, you'll see the plane won't actually follow the change because what it's actually doing is following the previous heading that we set. To get out of heading hold and back into heading select, as you can probably guess, you have to press the top of the select button again, and that'll switch you back into the previous mode that we were in. For now though, we're just going to switch back into LNAV because we just wanted to sequence through all of our waypoints for us to our destination. Finally, we have our vertical modes, and in VNAV alone, there are 3 different modes you could end up in: VNAV Alt, VNAV Speed, or VNAV Path. On the climb out, for the most part, you'll find yourself in VNAV speed like we are right now, and that means that our climb rate is actually being controlled by the airspeed that's being commanded by the autopilot. So in other words, it's going to climb as fast as it can while maintaining the speed that's been set up for the climb. VNAV Path, on the other hand, is the mode that you'll want to try your best to stay in while you're on your descent so that it stays on the ideal vertical path all the way down, and we'll look at that in a ton more detail in the next video on landing the 777. The other VNAV mode is VNAV Alt, and I'll actually force it into that mode now just to show you how it works by setting our cruise altitude to 31,000 feet or so. What that'll do is force the plane to level off at that altitude because it's effectively like having a restriction along our route. That switched the FMA mode into VNAV Alt, and this is exactly like when we were at the restriction earlier on when we were doing our climb out. So now if I change my altitude back to 36,000 feet, you can see the mode is staying as VNAV Alt. And if I want to get back into my climb up to my cruise altitude, I've got to press on the altitude intervent button again, and that'll get me going back in the climb and back into VNAV speed. Another option for climbing is to use flight level change, and when you pick it from the MCP, it'll open up the speed window, allowing you to pick the speed at which you want to climb, and then the plane will automatically pitch to maintain the best climb rate while staying at that speed. You can also change the speed from indicated airspeed into Mach and vice versa by pressing the button that's just above, and when you're up this high, generally speaking, you'll use the Mach numbers to decide what speed you're going to fly. One of the big differences with flight level change is that it doesn't follow restrictions. So if we were using it to climb out earlier when we were going past dark and our altitude window was set above our restriction altitude like it would have blown right by it like it wasn't there. So again, this can be useful if ATC asks you to do an off-schedule climb or descent. For now though, I'll switch back into VNAV, which will put us back into VNAV speed for the rest of our climb out to our cruise altitude. As we level off at our cruise altitude, the auto throttle is in speed mode like we expected it to switch into. We're still in LNAV, so we're following our waypoints automatically, and the vertical mode switched back into VNAV path since we are now on the ideal path like we want it to be, and it'll stay like that as we come up on our top of descent point, which is just about 60 miles off. We're going to learn all about energy and speed management in the descent approach and landing video that's going to be coming up next. And if you learned something useful here today, please make sure to like the video and subscribe so that you don't miss out on that last part of our series.